What is up guys, Karma Medic here, and believe it or not, I'm back with another dose. I'm currently in the apartment that I'm staying in for 2 months while I do research in Toronto. It isn't as cool as the one back in the UK, and you're also missing the orange dog. But anyway, today I want to talk about the UKCAT and more specifically abstract reasoning. So a lot of you have been requesting a video like this where I sort of dive deeper into a specific section of the UKCAT. So thank you guys for being vocal about that. What I'm going to do is talk about the abstract reasoning section a little bit, give a little bit more detail into the tips that I would advise for abstract reasoning, and then I'm going to try and solve a couple of questions on camera and record my thought process as I do that so that you guys can see what I'm thinking while I'm looking at the question. So with that out of the way, let's jump into a couple of tips about the abstract reasoning section. When you first start looking at abstract reasoning questions, everything is going to seem like gibberish. You really shouldn't rush or try to jump to the answer and solve the question as quickly as you can. You want to look at the question and stare at the pattern for as long as it takes until you figure it out by yourself. One by one, go through all the possible combinations and eliminations of patterns that you can think of. And I know that can take a lot of time and it can be very frustrating at first, but as you see more questions and as time passes, this becomes a lot easier. And like I mentioned in one of my previous videos, the SCANS method, S-C-A-N-S, is really useful and it can help you have a list of things that you can go through to check for what the pattern could be. The second thing I want to say is with abstract reasoning, you just really need a lot of exposure. You want to expose yourself to as many questions as possible because the more questions you see, the more likely you'll recognize a pattern that is similar to something that you've seen before. And that can really help speed things up on test day where you need to decipher the pattern in about 30 seconds. It's impossible in 30 seconds to go through scans fully step by step. You know, you're gonna think S stands for shape. Let me see, what are the shapes in this pattern? Squares, rectangles, triangles, whatever. Okay, let's move on to C. Color. Is it gray? Is it black? Is it blue? You just don't have time for that kind of thing. What ends up happening after you've done enough questions is that you in parallel go through all of the different components of SCAN at the same time, intuitively and naturally, once you've done enough questions. The idea with SCANs is that it gives you a list of things that could be patterns, and once you've looked at that list long enough, you've looked at so many different patterns, you'll eventually be able to match them really quickly. Now, full disclosure, I haven't done any UKCAT questions since 2016 when I took the exam. So I'm a little bit nervous that I'm going to be doing these on camera, and it might take me a little bit longer than normal, but the important thing is the way that I'm going to talk about my thought process, what I did to find the pattern. I encourage you to pause the video, take a look at the pattern, and see if you can figure out yourself. I'm going to switch over to my laptop now, and I'm going to have my face up in the corner, and hopefully you can see both at the same time, and that'll help me talk you guys through the question as I do it. So I have this Word document where I've screenshotted all the abstract reasoning questions from one of the online official UKCAT past papers. I've put them all in a row here, as you can see. And yeah, I'm just gonna go through them one by one and talk to you about what I was thinking while I was solving them and how I arrived at that conclusion. All right guys, so let's get started. For this one, I found this one quite easy and it came to me very quickly, because there really aren't a lot of shapes to take into account and think about here. So in set A and set B, we can see 4 shapes in each box, and they're very clearly laid out in the corners. One of the first things here I would test is whether a certain shape appears in a certain area. So maybe here in the circle, it's always in the top half, here it's in the bottom half. Okay, so I know that's not a rule. Maybe this cross is always on the right, but here it's on the left, so that's probably also not a rule. And then when I just took a little bit of a step back, what came to me really quickly was that there's an arrow pointing up in the top right corner here. And so I'm like, okay, that's very consistent here. Let's look at set B. There must be something else that's consistent in one corner. So if you take a step back in set B, you can see that there's a triangle in every bottom right corner of set B. So usually if you find a rule that's like this easy and this quick, it might be the case that there's another rule hidden somewhere in there. But with just one of the rules, you're almost always going to score 3 out of the 5 questions. And for a section like this where you're really crunched for time, I generally just take the first rule that I find, if it works and it's consistent, and I go with it. If I happen to see another rule, then that's great and I'll use it. But if I can only find one, then I just find the rule and I move on, because I want to save that time for maybe some of the harder questions that I need to think about a little bit longer. Okay, let's move on to this next one. Let's see. Okay, so this pattern just took me a really long time, but let me try and talk you guys through it. So in set A, the first thing that I realized, or the first thing that I looked at, was this box here. And you can see that there's 3 squares and 3 ovals. So I'm like, okay, cool. There's an equal number of squares as ovals. But then I look here and I'm like, okay, fine, my pattern works, that's cool. Then I look here and I realize that there's 2 ovals to 1 square. So that doesn't really make sense. Then I look at another box and there's 4 squares to 4 ovals. So I'm thinking, okay, my pattern is probably correct, but there must be something else that I am missing to make something like this box over here work. So this was actually really tricky. One black square, excuse me, counts as 2 ovals. So in this case you have 2 ovals, a black square counts as 2 squares. So in this case you have 2 ovals and 2 squares in theory, right? That's how you arrive at equal numbers of squares and ovals here. Actually, on top of that, a gray oval counts as 2 ovals. So here in this box, what you have actually is 3 squares and 3 ovals. Now, this is definitely one of the patterns that I would consider to be a lot more complicated. And if you don't get it, I think that's totally fine. There are always going to be patterns that are extremely difficult, and you just sort of have to move on. You have to take your guess, take your losses, and move on. And for me, definitely this is one of those patterns. Now, the important thing is that you will have realized that there's an equal number of squares and ovals here. Through that assumption, you're probably going to get 2 out of the 5 questions right. And that's good, because at least you save yourself on some of these questions that you would otherwise get 0. Okay, this pattern was super tricky. Let's look at set A first. So immediately when I look at set A, you realize there's a triangle, an arrow, and there's 2 triangles on the left and right. So the first thing I was trying to decipher was, does the arrow's direction mean anything? Arrow pointing in what direction, to me, seemed quite random, because you had this pointing in opposite direction to that, you had up, down, left, right, all kinds of different pointing. So I eliminated the arrows pointing was something meaningful. Now, what did change, which is important, is that the base of the arrow has a rectangle, or the head of the arrow has a rectangle. The first thing I tried to do was match this rectangle with one of the triangles. And you'll notice that one of the rectangles is always the same color as one of the triangles. What you end up realizing is that if the rectangle is on the base of the arrow, then the triangle on the right is the same color. If the rectangle is on the head of the arrow, then the triangle on the left is the same color. Okay guys, so for this pattern, the first thing that you'll realize is that there's an overwhelming number of shapes. Color is clearly not important because everything is white. So what I immediately start looking at is numbers. So the first thing I do is count, see if there's a difference in odd versus even. So are all the boxes in set A either odd or even total number of shapes? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, I can eliminate that pattern. The next thing I look at is either an odd or even number of a specific shape. So here there's 2 circles and here there's 3, so it's not only odd or only even. I do the same thing for squares. They're even, odd, and triangles, odd, even. So I've eliminated that as one of the potential patterns. Now what you start to think is, relative to each other, what are the numbers? So I'm always going to look at the easiest box first, and I see that there's 2 squares, 2 circles, and a triangle. So immediately I'm like, okay, there's the same number of squares as circles, so let me test that theory. I come here and I see 2 squares and 3 circles. That theory is eliminated. I go back to my simple box and I say, there's 1 triangle, 2 squares, and 2 circles. So there's 1 more square and circle than triangles. So I come to the next box and I test that. 1 triangle, so I'm looking for 2 squares or 2 circles. But here I realize that there's 3 circles. So that means the circle one is out of the question, but my 1 more square than triangle still works here. There's 2 squares, 1 triangle, 2 squares, 1 triangle. Here, 4 squares, 3 triangles. So I'm like, okay, this pattern works. Once I've tested a pattern and it works in 3 boxes, generally I'm like, okay, my pattern is good, and I can set that as a rule. So now in set A, now that I know that there's 1 more square than triangles, I know that there's going to be something similar in set B, because set A and set B are always somehow related. The pattern's always going to be something similar or like opposite. So I go to set B and I'm looking for shapes relative to each other that there's 1 more or 1 less of, okay? So let's look at the simplest box. 3 circles, 1 square, 1 triangle. So I can see that there's 2 more circles than squares or triangles. So let's test that in another box. Here there's 4 circles, and there's 2 squares and 1 triangle. So still there's 2 more circles than squares in this box. Triangles, that doesn't seem to be the case. Let's try a third box. 1, 2, 3 circles and 1 square. So now I can determine in set B that there's always 2 more circles than squares. The basic premise is that you start off with 1 rule, you test it. If it doesn't work, you move on. You put another rule, and you just keep going like that 1 by 1 till you get to your solution. So let's start with set A. All you can see is a bunch of lines and a bunch of breaks in those lines. So the first thing I would do is start counting the lines to see if there's an odd versus even rule. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so I know that set A isn't only odd or only even. After that, I'm going to start looking at the breaks. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So there's both odd and even, so I know that the odd versus even thing isn't going to work either. So now I start looking at intersections. Where do the lines overlap? So here we have 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So all the ones in set A appear to be odd. Let's look at set B. Now, once I have that rule in set A, I know that in set B, there's something very similar or something opposite, right? So now I'm expecting in set B that all the intersections are going to be even. So let's see. Here we have no intersections. Here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, looks like my rule doesn't work. Let's go back to set A and try that again. So I'm going to look at all the dashes, and I see 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So now I'm thinking, okay, maybe set A has 2 or 3 dashes. Set B, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. So now I have a new rule. Set A has either 2 or 3 dashes, and set B has either 1 or 4 dashes. So you see how you think you can have a rule down really, really well? Then it turns out it's wrong, but that's okay. If you test a rule and it doesn't work, just forget about it. Maybe a component of that rule is important somewhere else, but for the most part, personally, I just forget about it and I try and find a new rule. So yeah, there we go. Okay, now this one I found pretty difficult. Where should I start? Okay, so when I first looked at this, I was just overwhelmed with a bunch of boxes, a bunch of different colors, and I started testing rules. So the first thing that I tested in set A was the total number of boxes, okay? So I'll start really quick. 3, 6, 7, 8. 3, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I immediately know there's odd and even, so I'm gonna forget about the odd versus even rule. If you haven't noticed, that's one of the first things I tend to test. And the second thing I do is I look at the colors. So we have black, we have striped, and we have white. So white, we have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Ooh, interesting. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Still odd. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, cool. All the white boxes are odd. That might be useful. If we look at black, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. Eliminate that right there. Striped, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I can eliminate that right there. Now, if you go on to test that pattern, you'll realize that it doesn't work. So I'm going to save us the time of going through that. And I'm going to move on to the next thing that I tested, which is, there isn't really much left to do here. I was trying to look at the pattern from like a bird's eye view from far away, trying to see if there's anything that would elucidate. Maybe there's more black shapes on the top half of the square, or maybe there's more white on the right or on the left. But none of that was kind of working out. So then the next thing I moved on to is what's next to each other. So here we have stripe, black, black, stripe. So there's 2 blacks next to each other. And in this box, there's also 2 white. But something key to realize is that there's no 2 striped boxes next to each other. If we look at set A, we see white next to each other, black far apart, and striped far apart. Okay, so black was touching here, but it's not touching here. Let's keep that in mind. But black does touch here, black does touch here. So we know that black is allowed to touch each other. White, we also know is allowed to touch each other. But if we look at striped, everywhere in set A, striped boxes do not touch each other. So that's good, that's interesting. And I'm thinking that's probably the rule. So now let me look at set B. Now before even looking at set B, I know that either striped are gonna touch each other, or black are gonna not touch each other, or white are gonna not touch each other. And that's because the rule's always something opposite or similar to set A. So before I even look at set B, I already know that's what it's gonna be. Let's look at set B. We see black touching each other, which is the same as set A. So cool, my rule has nothing to do with black. We see white not touching each other, which is interesting. Okay, cool, white does not touch each other in set B. And we also see that striped does touch each other. So like I said, when I knew the pattern in set A, you could already know what the pattern is probably gonna be in set B, so it's quick to figure out. So here we see in set B that striped can touch each other, whereas in A, striped cannot touch each other. And in B, we also have white not touching each other. Okay, so there you go. This is a little bit more of a difficult one, and it actually took me quite some time to figure out. But yeah, again, when you're going through these questions, when you're learning how to do this at the beginning, just keep staring, keep testing until you come to the conclusion yourself. I cannot stress that enough. You want to keep thinking, you want to write things down, you want to make sure that you figure out the pattern yourself. That's the best way to learn, because once it clicks, you're not going to forget. Next time you look at a complicated pattern like this, you're going to immediately think, oh, are the colors touching each other? Are the shapes touching each other? In what orientation are they touching each other? You see, the more questions you do, the more exposure you get, and the easier it is to find the pattern next time. All right, let's move on to another one. Okay, have we come to these now? Okay, cool. Okay, so these are the other kinds of questions you'll encounter. I'm sure you guys already know about this. I don't remember if they're called type 2, type 3, type 4, or whatever, but the premise is the important part. So let's go through them. Okay, so this first one, okay, for these questions where it asks you which figure completes the series, you want to just look at one piece of the puzzle at a time and see what that one piece does. And that's always the biggest clue. It can be so confusing to look at all this together. Just look at one piece and see what it does, okay? So let's start here on the top left and look at this one black square. From the first picture, it moves 1 to the left, then 1 down, then 1 right. So we can very easily tell that this square is moving in an anti-clockwise pattern following the hexagon, okay? the circle is also moving anti-clockwise in the same way. So the next thing that we expect is a black square here and a circle over here. So let's look for a black square in this corner. So A is possible, B is not possible, C is possible, and D is not possible. Now we look at A and C and we realize, oh, there's the square in the correct place and there's the circle in the correct place. So we realize that we might have missed something. So the square is only shaded black. There's not much variation there. If we look at the circle, we can see that every time it moves a position, the black and the white get inverted between the inside and the outside of the box. So on the inside of the hexagon here, it's white, then black, then white, then black. So now we're expecting white on the inside. So we look at A, we see black on the inside. That can't be right. Our answer must be C. All right? So that's how you do it. Look at one thing, see how that changes, and you can figure out the pattern. Okay, so this one, what do we see? We see now moving from one box to the next, you add one line each time. Okay, cool. So in our last box, we expect there to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, plus 1, 7 lines. Now, we can see this is going to be wrong, this can be correct, this is wrong, and this can be correct. Now we want to look at what else changes. Okay, this black ball at the top alternates between black, white, white. So, and also white, black, white, black. So, let's see. If this is white, if this is black in this picture, then we know that in the next picture, this position needs to be white, okay? So A has white down here, but it doesn't have the line in the correct place. B has white down here with the line in the correct place. C has black here, D has black here, so we know our answer is B. Easy, right? Okay, so this question here, let's see. This is to this as this is to what? Okay, so let's look at one shape at a time and see what happens to it. So in the top left, this 0 gets rotated 45 degrees to the right. And we see that all these zeros do the same thing. Okay, cool. This arrow here flips from up to down. This flips from right to left. This goes from down to up. And these big fat arrows. Okay, so I'm actually not sure what's happening with the big thick arrows, but let's see if we can figure this out without it. So we know that the oval shape has to rotate 45 degrees. So let's look at these ovals and rotate them 45 degrees. And we can see that we can eliminate option C. So we have A, B, and D to work with. We know that these thin arrows, they just become the opposite. If they pointed up, they now point down. If they pointed right, they now point left. So we're looking, what we're gonna look for in the new shape is left, up, up, up. Let's start there. So left, up, that works. Left, up, down, A does not work. Left, up, C works. Left, up, this also works. But we had eliminated one of these due to rotation. So we're now left with B or D. Okay, let's look at the remaining arrows. So here we want a down. So B, this points down, and D, this points up. So there we go. Has to be B. So I don't even know what's happening with the big fat arrows, and you can still solve this pattern. So like I said before, if you haven't figured out the full pattern, you're probably still gonna figure it out with a smaller set of patterns, or you're at least gonna get the majority of the questions right. So if we look at the top left here, we can see that this white circle becomes black, this black circle becomes a white square, this circle black, white. Okay, hold on, I need a pen and paper for this. So obviously, I mean, if you're not doing this, please use a pen and paper to write down things so you don't forget them and keep track of all the rules. So I'm just gonna say, on the left, white circle becomes black circle. Black circle becomes white square. Black square becomes white circle. What am I missing? I'm missing white squares. White squares, if we look here, a white square becomes a black square. Now, obviously in the exam, you have pretty much no time to write this down. So look what I've written. Super, super simple. WC stands for white circle. BC stands for black circle, whatever. I'm sure you can interpret my key code here. All right. Anyway, the point is just write things down really quickly. Use like a code or something that you're familiar with because you don't want to waste any time. So now let's look at which one is correct. So white circles become black circles. So let's look at that first. So here, a white circle, I need to have a black circle in the top left, which means I can immediately eliminate B and C. So I'm gonna write down B, C, X, X, all right? Black circles become white squares. So this black circle here needs to become a white square in either A or D. And in D, it becomes a white circle, not a white square. So D is wrong, and we're gonna choose A. See how simple that is? Just look at one shape at a time, see what happens to it, and then you can really quickly eliminate the answers, because like you can see just one shape being wrong immediately eliminates that entire shape. So yeah, focus on one element at a time, figure out what's going on, and apply the rules. Okay guys, and I think that's about it. I hope that I was able to communicate well what I was thinking about going through the questions onto the camera. It turned out to be a lot harder than I thought it would be. And just a reminder to keep that scans list from one of my previous videos, the UKCAT one. Keep that list like printed or write it down somewhere and just have it next to you. So when you're looking at a pattern, if you've looked at it for a really long time and you just can't seem to figure out what it is, return to scans and see if there's an option that you might have missed. And as you do these questions, take the parts of scans and add details to them. For example, under color, right? If in one of the shapes you happen to see that colors next to each other are touching or colors next to each other are not touching, that's something that you should write down. Within scans, within color, colors may or may not be able to touch. So the next time you see a pattern with color, that's something that you'll immediately think of, that's something you'll immediately look at, and you might be able to find it a lot faster. Anyway guys, that's it for me. Please let me know what section you'd like me to do next, or any other videos that you might find useful or that you're interested in, and I'll try and get them out to you as fast as possible. Keep sending me questions on the student room, keep posting comments on these videos. Hope you guys are having a good time preparing for the UKCAT and enjoying your summer. Don't forget to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos from me, and that's it. It's been Karma Medic. I'm out. Peace.